The beginning of this chapter here is picking up from the end of the previous, where we saw Megumi talking to Angel, basically asking her to use her curse technique, which can negate other curse techniques, on the back of the prison realm to free GOJO. And she says that she'll do it, but they first have to help her take out a certain player in the game that she refers to as the Fallen One or the Disgraced One. And then we see Sukuna start talking to Yuji, and he says, you know, before you say anything, let me just tell you that I am the Fallen One / the Disgraced One. So coming into this chapter, we see Yuji taking in that information, but he's not saying anything at first. And he's trying to silently convey to Megumi using like this game of charades, like, hey, Sukuna's the Fallen One, okay? But don't say anything. But then once Megumi figures that out, he's like, oh, okay, now we have a new problem. Because I assume that once she finds out that Sukuna isn't Yuji, then she would have no problem just straight up taking Yuji out himself in order to get rid of Sukuna. And then we see Yuji asking, like, why did Sukuna go through the trouble to keep my mouth shut? It must be that the angel has an ability that can permanently annihilate Sukuna without any room for resurrection. And I assume she does have something like this because in the previous chapter, they asked her, can your technique revert possessed players to their original state? And she said, it's not impossible, but it's extremely likely they will die because the cursed object in the body fused. So it's difficult to strip one away. So it seems like she can do it since, you know, it's saying that it's not impossible. And this is possibly what's being alluded to here with Sukuna fearing this maybe, but I also do think that Sukuna will become autonomous at some point. Like he will be removed from Yuji, but I'm just not sure how it's going to go down. And then we see like this flashback of Sukuna talking to Megumi, referring to Yuji, saying, I'll tell you this, that he doesn't have the guts to end his own life. And Yuji's like, are you underestimating me? Have you forgotten I've already died once? We have enough points now. Everything's working out for Megumi. You know, now we can get his sister out. And as soon as they add the rules to be able to do that, he's like, you know, I'll gladly die. So Yuji is, you know, totally on board with sacrificing himself for the greater good. But then suddenly Angel says that like over 800 people have just entered the colony in like the last 10 minutes. And then it cuts away from this scene and we go to the other part of the chapter, but it's like, who are these 800 people? Well, I guess it's either the American military or the Chinese military or a mix of both possibly. And I say Chinese because going back to chapter 167, we saw him meeting with like I assume this to be the Chinese government. So everything that Kenjaku is saying here, where he's basically speed running the US and other governments on how Jujutsu Kaisen works. I assume he told this to the Chinese government and other governments as well. And this is also a flashback to February, and it's really unclear how long this took, but I assume this is happening over the span of like a couple weeks or months possibly. And Kenjaku ultimately winds up showing them this like projector movie thing of I guess Mekamaru's memories or what he was able to record through his puppets. And it comes down to this guy Cyrus being the most intrigued, who's also the assistant secretary of energy. And he's like, cursed energy is an energy source. You know, instead of using petroleum, natural gas, aka fossil fuels, or renewable energy, they can just use cursed energy, which he says is the cleanest energy of all human history, which I guess it is because it's just being made from a person. You don't need a factory to do it. And he's like, especially that white-haired guy. There's a good chance he could power a whole country by himself. And he's referring to GOJO, of course, and that's incredible. That's like, I guess, Gege power scaling GOJO right here, because we know that GOJO is like the freak of freaks. Like he was born to be the GOAT pretty much. So he has maybe the highest level of cursed energy ever, or at least that we know of. And apparently it's so immense that he could power a freaking country by himself. I mean, I don't know if that's literally the case, but I'm sure he can at least power a city. And then he's like, in any case, these resources called Jujutsu sorcerers or something we must seize and research immediately. And then Kenjaku tells them like, hey, in November, I'm going to do the culling game. Jujutsu sorcerers are going to gather for a ritual. It's like, what do you think, Mr. President? And then the president's like, don't tell me, the Jujutsu sorcerers. Are you saying that we should kidnap Japanese civilians as samples for experiments using my authority? So this is interesting, right? Because Kenjaku never really asks them of anything. He just explains how Jujutsu Kaisen works, and then that's pretty much it. And the Cyrus guy here is the one who is suddenly come up with the idea to use them as batteries. So unless he said this off panel, or this was his whole plan to plant this thought into them, like, hey, you know, you can, you know, kind of use them as batteries. Or Cyrus is like Kenjaku's inside man here. Regardless, it's just kind of odd the way that this sequence plays out. But yeah, I guess that's what the goal is here. Kenjaku wants to outsource Jujutsu sorcerers to the superpowers of the world so that they could be used as energy sources. And I guess this is kind of alluded to at the end of the Shibuya arc, chapter 136. When Tsukumo is talking to Kenjaku, she's like, the next stage of humanity lies in breaking away from cursed energy. Kenjaku's like, no, it lies in optimizing cursed energy. And then Tsukumo goes on to explain like why cursed energy and sorcerers and all that stuff only really appears in Japan, and it has to do with Tengen's barrier. It's necessary for optimizing cursed energy. The only ones capable of becoming sorcerers through Tengen and optimizing cursed energy are the humans of the country. And that would mean that Japan has a virtual monopoly on cursed energy. And then she says a certain superpower and the Middle East would not remain silent. And that's interesting, right? Because like America is being highlighted here, and I think this is Saudi Arabia and then other countries too. I guess China, India maybe is going to be included in that. And then going forward, she says flesh and blood humans are the energy source. So you can imagine the suffering that would result. That is a world far removed from the ideal that I pursue. So I guess that was kind of alluding to what's going on here, because she's not directly saying that they're being used as a battery. She's more so referring to like the literal sense of, you know, humans being the source for cursed energy. But the way that she words it here, flesh and blood human beings are the energy source. And that's directly after the panel of the superpowers that would not remain silent. But then Kenjaku's like, so what? We have different objectives. I do not wish for a world without cursed spirits or an idyllic and peaceful world. What I can create does not exceed the bounds of my own potential. Do you understand? What I should have created was chaos that not even I could control. So it's like, what does he want exactly? Because taking the sorcerers out of the culling game kind of defeats the purpose of the culling game. It also goes back to what Tengen was explaining to the group about what he theorizes Kenjaku wants, where he says that his objective is to force the evolution of all human beings throughout the land of Japan. The method of evolution that Kenjaku has chosen is merging of humankind and Tengen himself. And he's doing it using the barriers in the culling game, and they'll eventually pass through. And then also by that time, Kenjaku will try to absorb Tengen using, you know, cursed spirit manipulation, you know, Geto's ability, and then transfigure him afterwards. So does he like want to turn just all of the Japanese citizens into batteries and then disperse them out through the rest of the world? And then that's like his version of chaos? But then also it goes back to the 800 implied soldiers here entering the culling game. Like, I don't know how they're going to get out because technically they shouldn't be able to. Either this is literally what he wants, and he wants the soldiers to kidnap Japanese civilians, as the president says, or, you know, the strongest sorcerers that are left here, or he wants them to fight against them so that they can evolve further. Because going back to chapter 167, like right before we see Kenjaku talking to the Chinese government, Reggie is talking to Megumi, and he says, you can be certain that Kenjaku will drop a bomb when only the strong remain, and then the culling game will have served its purpose. And I always thought that that meant that he would eventually release Sukuna, like full powered, and then everybody would be forced to fight against him, and then they would all evolve that way. This could also be what the bomb is, just injecting, you know, 800 fully armed soldiers here. And I'm not really sure if the players remaining here would be able to stop them, to be honest. I mean, GOJO might be able to solo them, but no one here is obviously on GOJO's level. And guns are effective in this series. It's not like they're Dragon Ball Z characters or whatever. Man, 800 assault rifles versus like a handful of sorcerers here. I'm not entirely sure if the sorcerers would be able to make it out of this, but maybe that's what Kenjaku wants. It's like, I'm just confused as to what his ultimate motives are here, but let me know what you think in the comments. Maybe you guys can make more sense of it. Hopefully we get more information in the next chapter, because I'm just so intrigued but confused. If you like the video, guys, please give it a like and please subscribe if you haven't already. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.